Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Well, hey, Todd, today we're going to talk again about personality disorders, but this time we're going to shift from personality disorders to mood disorders, as in bipolar, which is a mood disorder. And we're going to contrast that to borderline personality disorder. So let's begin by, if you can, distinguish for us between what is a personality disorder and what is a mood disorder.
Sure. Personality disorder we defined in, I think, our last episode as a long-standing pattern of features, kind of our interior life, but as well as our interpersonal experiences. They permeate every facet of our life. And when they become problematic, like we see with borderline personality disorder, there's an exclusivity, right? There's a way of being that we're stuck in that's really problematic and causes disruption occupationally, relationally, etc. Versus when we're talking about a mood disorder, we're talking about something that's more genetically and biologically informed.
Okay.
So we see more clear evidence of markers for mood disorders. And there's some genetic testing that can actually be done through a psychiatrist's or physician's office, where they can look at even the level of what psychotropic medications might be most beneficial for addressing one's depression, etc. So what's interesting, though, is the reality is that borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder as a mood disorders typically being the umbrella where we talk about depressive and related. So when we talk about bipolar, the poles of bipolar are more manic and more depressive. So mood disorders, including bipolar, tend to be related in some way, shape, or form to depressive disorders. So it's kind of a general working definition for mood disorders. And we'll get into what manic is, et cetera, in a second. But it's interesting how colloquially we hear people who are struggling with bipolar disorder labeled as borderline. Yeah. Or we see someone who's truly borderline and without having that language, we'll say they're bipolar because they're really rigid, they really operate in extremes. We don't have other good language. We know bipolar because it's much more commonly diagnosed. We hear more commercials for medications for bipolar disorder than we do for borderline personality disorder. So it's just queued up more in our collective imaginations as a culture than something like borderline. So it fascinates me as a psychologist knowing how discrete and distinct the two really are, that the social perception is that there's some similarity or they're used synonymously. So what that looks like, I would say that a mood disorder is much more of a state-driven, right? Like it's happening right now. There is, kind of like we talked about last time, there's an equation of if you have these symptoms for this duration, then you qualify for this diagnosis. You can have, so with depression, right? Like you can have major depressive disorder of any severity, any kind of single episode or recurrence over time. And it's just true for then. Doesn't mean that you're always going to have that. It's not a characterological feature. It's not a personality part of you that pervades over time every aspect of your life. It's more of a situational or circumstantial indicator. So you have people who have had a depressive episode, like they had diagnosable major depressive disorder once in their life, and that was it. Yeah. It was awakened more by circumstance. It was time stamped, like symptoms started, they experienced them, they got treatment, either medication or therapy, change in lifestyle, ideally all of the above, meaning like sleep and diet and exercise and those things, which have been proven to be as effective. Some research out of KU in the last 10 years, lifestyle habit changes tend to be as effective as the most effective antidepressant.
Interesting.
Says something, right? Like, are we willing to play the long game with our mental wellness? Or do we just, pills are great, right? Like they help provide temporary relief. But the psychopharmacological industry was never created as, like, at least in mood disorders, like to be a long-standing. Now, that'll change a little bit when we get to bipolar because of the nature of manic episodes and how treatment has looked in the psychiatric community versus depression. But like antidepressants are there to help jumpstart the body in many regards. And we could talk about dysthymia, which is a kind of subclinical level of depression that probably is going to persist a lot longer. It's not a personality. It's just, again, in our bodies, a disorder that, again, it's not like these deep depressive spaces that we see with major depressive disorder, but it is going to last quite a bit longer, but be maybe less intrusive. Not to say it's insignificant, but it won't be as intrusive as true major depressive episodes or major depressive disorder would be. So mood disorders, so again, back to lifestyle habit changes, right? Like we tend to shy away from those, but they really are the long game. And it's about working in harmony with our bodies, dietary, sleep, and exercise.
And what you're talking about is how each one of those, diet, exercise, sleep, impacts the biochemistry and your entire nervous system. And so when I go to that level, when I dig into, oh wow, there are ways that, if I eat sugar, it's going to create a certain biochemical reaction. Whenever I exercise, the breathing that I'm doing is shifting the biochemicals in my brain, which then affects my nervous system and et cetera.
Your heart rate increases, right? Like
all of that.
All of serotonin gets produced, endorphins get produced if you exercise long enough, right? Like it really is, I'm gonna call it a cleanse for your body, but it is cleansing active tense as far as moving waste out of your body. You're getting rid of CO2, you're, right, like enhancing circulation. It really is a holistic, whole organismic experience toward our wellness. Same thing with getting 7+ hours of sleep at night, ideally before midnight. Right? Like we like to be night owls as a culture, the late show, the whatever. I try and get to bed before 10 if I can, as many nights as I can, because our bodies replenish, like neurologically, and in our bodies, we're replenishing at about twice the rate before midnight as we are after midnight in our circadian rhythms.
And we're talking massive research. We're not talking about somebody who just felt better in the morning.
This isn't just Ben Franklin saying like early to bed, early to rise makes men healthy, wealthy, and wise. Like that's true.
Right.
Not just because he said it, but because now we have this litany of research that suggests, wow, like here's how we recalibrate our bodies if we're struggling with, take your pick, we're talking about mood disorders, but take your pick of anxieties or distresses or
all of it. Well, I see a squirrel. So I'm going to take us off road for a minute. Last time we talked just a minute at the beginning about how COVID is showing up in personality shifts in people, though this isn't in the news. Right. This is in research papers. And I know people who have loss of memory because of post-COVID experiencing. And it does make me curious if does the COVID experience do something to the biochemicals of the brain, and what does that mean to us today as professionals?
Great question. My response to that would be, because we're still in it, it's going to be really difficult for us to measure that. How much of it is truly by way of infection, and how much of that is by way of the fact that life has been disrupted, work has translated from in the office to at home, and there's a unique set of stressors that coincide with that. There's a reason I rent an office, let me tell you that much. As an online professor, right? Like I tried it for about 3 weeks, and I was like, dear Jesus, help me. Like this is not my space. Like I can't work here. Right? And all of us were thrown back into that mix and trying to navigate. I just saw in the news a company fired hundreds of people because they were getting paid for 8 hours a day, but on aggregate working about 2 hours a day. And the CEO is like, you're stealing from the company, rather than kind of slowing down and be like, what can we do to help you be more productive in that space? Because until you've done it, and most of us have now, until you've lived that reality, you're just like, oh, it's working from home in the office. No. Like your brain is queued up in a completely different set of thought patterns and responses and energy at home versus, and we talked about last time about it's important to go to church. It's important to figure out a space for work. And even if it's at home, it's still different than physically moving into a working environment. Right. So how much of that change neurologically is due to COVID infection versus just the reality of, and certainly in that conversation we're talking about long COVID and the personality changes that we see with long COVID as a unique subset of clinical outcomes for people who get infected with coronavirus versus the fact that all of us have had these major shifts at some point. right? Low motivation, decreased energy, difficulty sleeping, irritability, depressed mood. I would love to meet the person who in the last 20, 21 months can say, like, honest to goodness, they've never experienced any of that.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't buy it. I would say, like, thank you for sharing your opinion. Like, you might need to listen to our last podcast because you have a lack of self-awareness. Right?
Right.
Not all lack of self-awareness is personality disorder. Sometimes we selectively like tune out from that. Like, I don't want to pay attention to this survival mechanism, right? Like, I don't want to know what's happening in my body. I don't want to know what's happening in my mood because it would be overwhelming.
Yeah.
Right. So if somebody sat across from me and said, like, nope, haven't experienced any of those, Todd, I would say, okay, like, let's help you attune, right? Like, let's go down into your body and help you start assessing what's there. Because if your mind can't access it, like Bessel van der Kolk's work, your body keeps a score. Our body is there to be the container for and the reminder for, like, hey, there's significant stuff that we've experienced. Sometimes it just shows up in headaches and backaches and muscle aches and pancreatitis and all sorts of random ways.
Yeah. Yeah,
Like,
absolutely.
What are we holding on to?
Yeah.
Okay, like, your body is going to help you hold on to that until it's a safe enough space, a level enough space for all that stuff to start being worked out. There's just some people. So if they haven't experienced that list of things that, by the way, are all indicators of major depressive disorder, if they haven't experienced those, okay, good. Like, once things stabilize, like, then it will be more evident. You won't hear or read this anywhere because I haven't, like, published it anywhere. But I talk a lot with my clients about emotional hangovers and how in survival mode, right? Like, think about, like, you might feel fear if you're running from a bear. All you know is, like, you felt fear and now you're running for your life. Mm-hmm. Right? Like, you're not feeling the fear, like you're feeling, and in fact, you're probably feeling like 10 feet tall and bulletproof. Yeah. Sprinting as fast as you can, right? Like, toward the bear if you're of a really unique psychological makeup, right? Most of us are going to be running away from the bear. Yeah. Most of us will be grateful as we're running if you're running toward the bear and the rest of us are running away from the bear. Right, but, like, we're in that space of distress, we're not actually metabolizing or processing our emotions. Yeah. Like, we do a lot of that in reflection. And when we don't process our emotions in reflection, emotional hangover is the construct that I use for that.
Yeah, and what is an emotional hangover?
Well, it's the aftermath of a really big emotional experience, and it tends to be worsened if we don't ever double back and actually process through. Yeah. That was really scary. I saw the bear, I heard the roar, I turned and looked. And we give language, kind of how God designed our brains to regulate emotion, and this will parlay into major depressive stuff and mood disorders before we get to bipolar. We use logic and we use our language to down-regulate and process through and really put to rest any of the emotional intensification that we've experienced. Yeah. Right? There was a bear. The bear was brown. I heard it roar. I was terrified. I started to run. I make sense of the story. Right? We do this. Car accidents, stressful games. I've done this a couple times with the Chiefs this year. Like, how did we fumble? Like, why is he throwing that ball? Like, what is happening? Maybe we're also traumatized by the Super Bowl from last year. I have no idea. Right, but, like, we process our emotion in that way. Right, like, otherwise we hold on to it. Right, it's still there. We don't want to acknowledge that it's there, but it's impacting us. Yeah. Right, emotional hangover. I think what's interesting is for many, many people, right? Like, yes, for some, there's a genetic predisposition to major depressive disorder that as soon as the right stressors have been in place for a long enough period of time, like, it kicks on. For many of us, it's more acquired, and it's I would say by way of an emotional hangover, where we have anxieties and stresses and disappointments and things that are significant enough to move our emotional needle, but we never double back to them. We don't take the time, or we don't have access to a space where we have trusted people that we can break those down and digest the experience, tell our story, right? When we live in that perpetual emotional hangover, it does make us more irritable. It decreases the positivity of our mood. It leaves us feeling more anxious. It works its way down into our bodies. And then all of a sudden, we've got the building blocks of a major depressive episode.
Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name is Patrick Norris, and I am a husband, father, pastor of 35 years, and a strategic therapeutic mentor to leaders in all arenas of life. I am an inerrantist, a Calvinist Arminian betweenist, a Holy Spirit continuist, and a finished work of Christ redemptionist. Red Ink Revival was designed to create a revival in the heart, soul, and brains of Christian leaders from all spheres of influence. Our team of pastors, psychologists, and therapists facilitate our life-changing leadership, personal growth, and emotional wholeness experiences. Our goal is to bring a revival, an integrated wholeness to pastors, church staff, the local church, and the universal Big C church around the world. This includes marketplace leaders, educators, foster adoptive parents, and so much more. If this podcast is providing value to you, would you consider subscribing to it wherever you get your podcast? Also, please like the episodes, comment on them, and share them on your social media feeds. And one more big favor. If you like the show, please go review it at Apple. And if it's true of you, give us 5 stars. Now let's go back to this week's episode. So when we talked about personality disorders, we were talking about, it seems like that the needle, even in private conversations with professionals like yourself, that the tendency is to believe that the personality disorder is built in wound profiling. It's injuries relationally and interpersonally over time that have forged the personality that now then is a disorder, even though there could be some genetic markers, but we still, those are hard to quantify. But when you're talking about a mood disorder, it does sound like that at the beginning you were saying that it could have a higher genetic factor. And I just want to clarify that. Is it a higher genetic factor and maybe not as much interpersonal that's creating the bipolar condition?
Well, hold on to bipolar for a second. Mood disorders in general, like yes, I would say there's a stronger underpinning of genetic predisposition.
Okay.
Yeah. And some of us will be wired more toward anxiety, which is not a mood disorder, it's an anxiety disorder, right? We know, we've talked about, I think on this podcast, epigenetics and the predisposition with trauma and predisposition to PTSD by way of epigenetics. So there's just a lot, right? There's a lot in this space that's moving and shifting. I think what's interesting though is like with some of the advances in science, right? Like we're talking about major depressive disorder here, how with genetic testing we can look at sooner, right? It used to be like spaghetti at the wall, right? Psychotropic medications, specifically antidepressants. It was like, let's throw you on something, give it 2 weeks to take, let's evaluate for 2 weeks after that. Okay, it's been a month, your mood hasn't changed, let's trade one out. Now it's 2 more weeks, 2 to assess. That one didn't work, so now we're 2 months into this, right? Like hopelessness, helplessness is increasing.
Yeah.
Right, now we can assess like, okay, on a genetic level, like what's gonna be the best fit? We can have a patient who's doing this right now, right? Like, amazing. He's been through that litany of everything I've tried, hasn't worked. He goes, gets genetic testing done. Every single one of the things that he's ever been prescribed has moderate to high improbability of success. Right, and he's like, where has this been my entire life? Like, it's amazing, isn't it? So yes, like that genetic dynamic with mood disorders is incredibly helpful for treating clinicians to be able to say like, let's intervene with this specific psychotropic medication. That's a good fit, right? Like it's the right key in that lock to open what we need to open instead of trying to fidget with it and trying to make a key fit, which is what we kind of used to do. So yes, there's just more evidence of, right? And for the upside, right? Like that feels like, oh great, it's in my body. What can I do about this? Medical advances, like there's actually a lot we can do, and there's upside with this. Talking about mood disorders, depressive, right? Like we're talking about this depressive end of the continuum.
No, when we started with bipolar, looking at it as a mood disorder, and then you jumped into depressive. Explain why. Why are we talking about depressive mood disorder when we started with bipolar?
On the same page. So why bipolar disorder? There's a couple different types, right? We'll go bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 to use the diagnostic language. So let's start with bipolar 2 and go kind of in reverse order. Bipolar 2 is a diagnosis where you have to have had a major depressive experience.
Okay.
So criteria for that have to have been met.
Yeah.
And a hypomanic episode.
Hypomanic meaning?
Yeah. Less severe, less intense. And I'm going to define manic here in a little bit.
Okay.
Right? But hypo meaning lesser than.
Yeah.
Manic we'll define here in a second. Right. So we have a type of bipolar disorder where that depressive piece is a requirement.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yep. And bipolar 1 operates a little bit differently. It's a manic episode So let's define that for people.
Yeah.
Manic episode is a space where there's an increased sense of energy, a decreased need for sleep, a ton of, I'll call them compulsive behaviors, right? Like things that people aren't necessarily desiring to be doing, but they find themselves doing them anyway. Oftentimes it's risky. So spending money they don't have, and I mean like en masse, sometimes it's gambling, making significant life decisions, quitting jobs, elevated mood, right? Like I'm on top of the world. Flight of ideas is another one. They feel like their minds are just racing, and right? It's like, so people will write books, people will do all sorts of things, right? Like rearrange their entire house, paint their entire home, right? But again, decreased need for sleep. We might be talking about 3 full days without sleep, or very minimal sleep for an hour or 2 at a time. But again, there's a grandiosity to it. It's not narcissism, but there's just a scope of imperviousness, right? Like nothing can stop me, nothing can slow me down. And it shows up with all these kind of different symptoms, different patterns of symptoms that different individuals are going to experience. All right, so bipolar 1, like, diagnosable when we see that manic episode. Some people will have a depressive experience as well, right? So mood disorders, depression is just much more common, quite frankly. Like major depressive disorder, much more common than bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder, right, can be intense. And I think that's part of where our culture imagination around bipolar has gotten is there's just an intensity. There can be an irritability. There can just be like a mean nastiness to it. A lot of it has to do with mood fluctuation. So another type, kind of a subtype, cyclothymia would be more rapid cycling. So maybe like dysthymia, it's less severe, but you can see more rapid cycling over the course of time with that.
That's interesting.
So, yeah, it's amazing how we talk about somebody who's bipolar because we see their mood shift when the look I see on your face is, whoa, like this is a very different construct than I understood this to be, just from listening to people talk, or if we just heard people say like, wow, that's so bipolar, right? They might be meaning like, wow, there was an extreme shift, right? Like you went from really happy to really sad. That's not bipolar disorder.
Yeah.
It's not bipolar. Like that might be a mood swing, a mood shift, which we see in the context of hypomanic or manic episodes where there can be quickly changing, call it labile mood.
Yeah.
That's what we call that, quickly shifting, quickly changing mood. But like that by itself is a far cry from what we really see 3D with, like when we move away from that two-dimensional, like, okay, here's a thing, and we call that bipolar. Like really we're talking about something very different than most people really understand when they use that language.
Yeah, would it be fair in the way that we talked about borderline personality disorder that you could actually have some of the markers and not be diagnosable? Would it be fair to say that same kind of thing here with bipolar, where a person who is extreme might be presenting certain markers, but not diagnosable with the other features that are required for that person to be considered bipolar?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we think about, right? Like think about times of elation, like where you feel like you can just conquer the world. You got a promotion. I think about like when I got engaged to my wife, Rebecca, wife, Rebecca, right? Like the sense of just like, like nothing can get to me. I didn't sleep well. I think of another time, like a joyful time in my life, obviously having kids, but also my 4th baby, my truck, when I bought my truck, right? Like it's sitting outside. You're like, what? Like it's old, it's beat up, it's dirty. Like I love that thing. I love it. All right, but I can remember even the night I bought that, right? Like trying to fall asleep. I didn't sleep. I'm there in sweats, right? Like my mind is racing. Like, what have I done? Like, the object of my desire, this thing I love, like I've finally been able to purchase, but then there's just that sense of like, uh-oh. Like, can I handle this? Like, did I stretch this too thin? Like, obviously not. God's provision has been ridiculous. It's actually paid off now.
Praise God for that, man.
I was in a space where, like, objectively you could say, like, okay, his mood is inflated, he's not sleeping, he's got a racing mind. Like, we've got to be really careful with armchair diagnostics. And I think with bipolar, more than anything else in our culture, I see us point this out, again, because we take a misunderstanding of what this clinical diagnosis really is. We apply it really haphazardly with like, something's up his craw. I'm not sure what his problem is. He's all over the place. Like, therefore, like.
Hey, have you ever wanted to explore how your backstory is influencing your present story? Have you ever wondered why you were driven the way you were driven, or why you want the things you so deeply want, or why you might be triggered the way you're triggered? Maybe there's something in your life that keeps derailing you or exposing the fractures in your heart and soul. At Red Ink Revival, I facilitate groups of 6 to 10 men or 6 to 10 ladies in an exploration process that includes worksheets, tools for discovery, and insights into personal motivations, torments, and reactions. And it's all done online through Zoom in a short 6-week experience. Now don't worry, you won't be required to share anything you don't want to. Your story is yours to share when and where you're ready. But first, you owe it to yourself to know what that story actually is. Our alumni report having life-changing experiences and integrations in all spheres of life. They report it actually felt like they entered into a revival. They even say they now lead others like never before as they instinctively map their teammates' own story considerations. We're developing groups specific for individual classifications like senior pastors or spouses, church staff, educators, foster adoption parents, marketplace leaders, and churches at large. Go to redinkrevival.com and find the events tab to learn more. Yeah, you know, I, as a professional and with the work I do with Red Ink Revival, even coaching, and I do directive therapeutic stuff. I know where we're headed. I know what I want to work on. I know, how to help some people deal with a lot of the biochemical issues that create emotional experiencing. However, I just want to be real clear. Any of these personality disorders or mood disorders, I'm going to be pretty quick being the operable word. I'm going to be pretty quick to refer that out. I need somebody like you dealing with that. However, that there are times that it's weird that I, as a pastor, getting to know people, after you're with somebody who, I have had enough people who did have diagnosable, and I know because they were diagnosed with bipolar, and I can smell it. I mean, it's like now that doesn't mean everyone that presents that I would smell, but often I'll smell a particular thing and be like, oh yeah, it's bipolar. I guarantee you that if I get into their life and find out, that it's there. So there are things there that, and of course when I say all that, I'm not saying that as a professional. I'm saying that as somebody who's just been around different people.
Enough experience being close to people's lives, and they let you into their life, and you have a schematic that you can use.
A schematic.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think what's hard about bipolar in particular, bipolar 1, is a lot of folks just don't comply with treatment regimens.
Wow.
Right? I mean, how many famous authors, how many famous musicians, how many famous artists, how many famous CEOs over time, creatives, movers and shakers of industry, looking back at their lives posthumously, we look at those and we're like, that's probably undiagnosed. Some of them diagnosed, but others, you're like, how much of the manic energy really propelled them?
Yeah.
It's torturous.
Right.
But if you find that, it's your primary space of outpouring of creativity and genius.
Yeah.
I've talked to people who say, it's my superpower. Why would I stay on this medication that, neuters my genius?
Yeah, and that makes sense.
But it also comes with a huge deal of risk, too, right? It's not
because
just
addiction seems to have, talk about the relationship with addiction, because if you have these heightened involvement and engagement like gambling, but the same would be for all of the addictions, there maybe be a higher vulnerability for a person.
So I think about what Pat Carnes defines as, addiction, sexual addiction in particular, but I think all addictions being pathological relationships with mood-altering experiences. And if you're in a space, not even in like a manic episode, right? Like so take the like, I'm not in a manic episode, I'm not in a depressive episode, but I have an experience, I have a history of, I've been diagnosed with this, and there's more frequency of emotional shifting.
Yeah.
Right, that means there's a higher probability of that individual being in an undesirable mood state. And we know that people who don't have the tools to navigate dysphoric, undesirable mood states are going to externalize. They're going to move toward mood-altering experiences, per Carnes' language. And our culture is full of invitations to addiction. Food, gambling, gaming, social media, work, sex, drugs, alcohol, caffeine, take your pick. Right? Most folks presenting at treatment for any type of disorder have 3 or more co-occurring addictions. Right? But you're right, like that there is soil that trends toward more addictive styles, addictive functioning when we have a bipolar disorder present.
How would you like to reboot your personal finances this year? How would you like to take control of your money, turning small wins into big results? I want to encourage you to check out my wife Tina's financial coaching business at tinanorris.org. You might be wondering, what is a financial coach? A coach is someone who will personally team up with you to outline financial goals, inspire you with energy, help you stay focused on your goals, and so much more. You can do it all through Zoom, and she provides a free initial consultation, so there's no pain or cost to you for your first steps. Maybe you've been to several Financial Peace University cycles, left with great intentions, but struggled to execute. You need a trainer, a coach, another human that won't shame or judge you to help you stay on track. She works with clients that are single parents, everyday people, pastors and church staff, as well as high-income professionals. If you have friends, church members, clients, or even young marrieds that are launching their financial lives, you'll do them all a favor to have them check out this amazing option. If professional athletes need a coach to win the day, to fulfill their dreams, then you and I do too. And you won't find anybody better to help you get there than Tina Norris. Set up your free consultation from anywhere in the world today. Go to tinanorris.org to find out all the details. When I talk to people, with a lot of clients that I work with, there will be some armchair quarterbacking from family members. They'll say, you must be bipolar. Or I know some clients who have actually had MDs who have diagnosed them, but some of them only had a questionnaire of about 10 questions and then said, nope, you are diagnosed with bipolar mood disorder. And what is interesting is that when you begin to get into some of the clients that I've worked with, you may have somebody who's on, let's say, when you interview them, they are watching, 3 hours or more of social media. They're on YouTube, they're gaming, young people in their 20s and 30s now, they're high gamers, so they're video gaming for 2 or 3 hours at a time, or then you enter into the porn, masturbation, orgasm sequence. And so on a biochemical level, as an example, from what I understand, somewhere in the 30, 50 range, I've got different nanogram referencing that whatever your stable dopamine baseline is biochemically, that you're going to have significant multiples of that dopamine hit when you have an orgasm, as an example. And so when you have that heightened, if you don't have a human that you're with, then you don't have the oxytocin to mitigate the cortisol, and then the heightened oxytocin that's not there, or the vasopressin that's not there, will cause you to go into the pain cycle, because the same neural pathways do both pleasure and pain. And so a person will get into a depressive state. They'll get into a sense of self-deprecation, contempt. They will have disgust for themselves. They'll be dealing with all of this deep emotional stuff going on. So when I look at all of this, the social media is a high dopamine experience. Then you're watching the news, you're watching YouTubes, you are engaging video gaming, war type scenarios. And then there is this other piece of porn and masturbation and orgasm that is exhausting the dopamine circuits, and the dopamine circuits cannot stay at a heightened level. They're going to have an equal, is the operative word, an equal pain level. Now, when I say pain, I'm not just talking about, some stereotypical suffering, like that you've got to go into some kind of, beating yourself or some other kind of suffering. I'm talking about the suffering of, I have opposition that now then I've got to have perseverance to fight through. And there's suffering involved in that.
Yeah, I would suggest it's a type of withdrawal. Neurochemically.
Neurochemical withdrawal that puts you more in a depressive state.
Absolutely.
So some people who I know have been diagnosed with bipolar, maybe they are, but by working with them on these other dopamine features, you're able to get them back to a stable state and they return back to a place of joy. But you got to cut out all of that exhausting behavior to your dopamine circuits. So talk to us a little bit about that whole side of what some people might be doing that makes them think that they would have these features that they actually don't.
Yeah. Technological stimulation is an interesting one for me. I cited that study done by KU a while back. 2012, what we're 5 years into Facebook, like we're not, 14, 15 years into Facebook now,
right.
and everything else that's spiraled off of that with Snapchat and Twitter and Instagram and
TikTok.
Fill in the blank.
Yeah.
Right, like I just wonder how our social media consumption has changed over time, because I would add, if I was adding to that list of significant variables to cut out or modify in lifestyle, like getting away from screen time, getting away from video games, getting away from social media, for a couple different reasons. Like one, you talk about the dopamine drip, but two, I think like it takes us out of our bodies. And that so much of addressing bipolar illnesses, mood disorders more generally, to large measures about getting back in our bodies. And I think it's interesting as a culture, we spend so much time out of, what do I mean by that? People are probably thinking that, like, I'm not in my body, I'm floating up, no, like misattuned or disengaged from our bodies, right? But I think that's part, when I hear about how people are self-medicating is really what we're describing here. Self-medication is about, and so I think we have these, anthropologically, we have these experiences. We don't want to navigate them. We turn on the dopamine drip in an effort to escape them.
Yes.
Our bodies then hold the reminiscence of those things, holding onto it until such a time as we can metabolize it. And when our bodies are like, okay, now's the time, we amplify the dopamine drip. Dopamine's actually very colonialistic. Like it will take over and convert receptor sites for serotonin, for instance. So we wonder why depressive mood emerges out of hyperdopaminergic living. Well, it's because like the neurological channels for the good stuff, the calming, connective, down-regulating stuff, aren't there. Like they've become, so then withdrawal is really like our body working to reset and recalibrate.
Yeah.
Right, but it is. So there's this, we got to get back in our bodies.
Yeah.
Right, like it's why exercise is so important. It's why prayer, I would say, as a believer is so important.
Yes.
Like stilling ourselves and in communion with the Lord, right? Like letting our bodies have down regulation time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Movement, so important. Right. But often, right, like especially with mood disorders, and I want to at some point talk about the depressive state to depressive episode to major depressive disorder. And then like adjunctive to that might be a bipolar 2 experience, right? Like, so there's a chain, right? This all matters because there's a chain of depressive energy that could be compounding that leaves us more susceptible to having to navigate a major depressive episode and or a bipolar 2 kind of moment. But again, right, like we spend so much time outside of our bodies, right? And we'll maybe go see a physician if, right, like I feel like my chest is being sat on by an elephant, like you're having a heart attack, right? Like, what were the micro indicators of movement in that direction? Like, every person I've ever talked to that had a heart attack, like there was indicators days, weeks, oftentimes months before. It's like, that's nothing, right? Like, it's just indigestion. Like, I just had Indian food. That was 2 weeks ago, right? You're not having heartburn because you had Indian food 2 weeks ago. Right? But like, and we could go ad nauseum. We as men are worse about it than women. But I don't think we can talk about mood disorders and even bipolar, which is like our bodies get pulled back online in an incredibly intense way if we're talking about a manic episode, right? And we're still not in our bodies. Our bodies are doing things, and we think we're moving in harmony with them, but we don't have, like, we're not actively at the wheel in that. It's a ton of compulsive energy and a ton of compulsive decision making. And I think that's where medicine, right, like, is intended to buy some space to help attune us to our bodies in a different way. And it's where I think diet and exercise and sleep are so critical about helping us get back in our bodies, but we've also got to cut out something like TV, video gaming, social media, screen time largely, which oftentimes is a mechanism for escape. And we say, like, well, I'm just sitting here on the couch, it's a good thing. Like, like, not if it's actively keeping you from, like, having to feel and experience and navigate what it is that your body is trying to help you resolve.
Pastors, did you know that upwards of 70% of the men in your congregation are regularly accessing pornography, stuck in shame, torn in conflict, and therefore immobilized for zealous ministry? That's 7 out of 10. The problem is not going to go away. What are you doing to lead your men into wholeness? Porn and sex addiction is characterized by undesirable compulsive behaviors that feature incongruence with personal values, and it interferes with normal living, causing stress on their relationships with God, family, friends, loved ones, and possibly even their own work environment. Well, where do you send men to recover and become both whole and integrated? Red Ink Recovery offers a unique program exclusive to porn and sex-related addictions. Our clinical professionals, our psychologists and therapists, have created a transformative treatment process that collects the dots, connects the dots, and corrects the dots that have driven the addictions. Our approach heals the heart, restores the soul, and rebuilds the neuroplasticity of the brain. Our clients find their lives have been wildly marked by Christ as they are given a path for trust being rebuilt. And they are resourced for far greater relationships and intimacy than they have ever known before. All of our professional teammates are experts in the field of sexual addiction. They are all trained by Dr. Patrick Carnes and certified by the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. Dr. Carnes is known as the father and curator of modern sexual addiction recovery as a movement. Pastors, we encourage you to recommend your men who struggle to come to one of our intensives. If you are just a simple man that struggles, maybe you're new to the faith or you don't even know what you believe about Christ, be encouraged to join us. We will honor your journey and give you the tools to live in wholeness. To find out more about our porn and sex addiction intensives and when the next one is, go to redinkrevival.com.
And typically, it seems that there's this cocktail around grief, anxiety, and anger. And the anger tends to move from a healthy sense of justice to then into this thing where I'm just angry because things that I've tried didn't work and it doesn't feel fair. And then you get into the rage, panic, because nothing's controllable. But those three together seem to be over and over what is driving so many of our stupid behaviors, so many things that are unmanageable, uncontrollable, And the best thing to do is, rather than make it an enemy, turn towards it, see what it's doing. How is it trying to serve you? Because grief is trying to serve you. It's trying to bless you. It's just that when you put those three together, it will use medications, created and fabricated medications like gambling, overspending, buying way too many things than you should, all the way to
Which again, like just
porn
because
and
someone's
so on.
doing those things doesn't make them bipolar.
Yes.
It's just that with a true manic episode, like we're seeing that with an intensity.
Yeah.
None of it's healthy.
Yeah.
But it's just, there's a marked difference when it's a true manic episode.
Yeah.
And there's not even awareness of that, or it's driven by, right? Like it's almost like rocket fuel in your vehicle.
Yeah.
Right? Like you might be trying to steer, but like that vehicle is being propelled so quickly that like there's no real, and I'm thinking of a very sad story that I heard one time about a guy who actually put rocket fuel in his vehicle, and I won't tell you how that story ends, but not positively. Right? Like that to me, though, that becomes the hallmark kind of metaphor for what's it like to be in a truly bipolar 1 manic episode. You might feel like the king of the world, like I'm flying.
Yeah, right.
Right? But like that inevitable crash is going to happen.
Yeah, because you can't steer.
And it's not good because you can't steer, right? Like you might be in the car, you might have the perception of, right? Like I'm moving the steering wheel.
Yeah.
The story I'm talking about, like the wheels weren't even on the ground for this gentleman. You can steer the steering wheel all you want, but if your wheels aren't on the ground, like you're not changing course.
Wow. It sounds like that if I'm a family member, a pastor, an organizational leader, and there's somebody who might be presenting some of these features, it sounds like that the best thing we can do is, the baseline issues of helping somebody become self-aware, continuing to create an ecosystem that compels them into interpersonal environments where they discover what is happening, getting them back into their body. But it sounds like a huge piece is helping them move towards medication so that it buys them space to be able to actually do all that.
Can I get a little bit controversial on here?
Please.
And I want to walk compassionately. I want to walk really tenderly, but I also want to walk really honestly.
Yeah.
15 years of being a professional, not to not include grad school. So we're coming up on 20 years worth of true professional experience that I've got. I've not seen any other mental illness or diagnosable condition leveraged toward victimhood in the same way that I have bipolar disorders.
Can you explain that?
What I mean by that is people blaming their other life mistakes, things that their bipolar has nothing to do with. They'll use that as their primary explanation for why they did a certain thing or why they can't do a certain thing. Or some of that's legitimate, right? Like there are times when folks are just incapacitated by life circumstance and the reality of their illness.
Yeah.
My experience, right? Like anecdotally, just me. This isn't reams of clinical literature that I'm citing. Anecdotally and in conversation with my network of colleagues, like far and away, like bipolar illness becomes the leveraging point for not having to take responsibility for occupational, financial, relational, spiritual dimensions of life. And it's not a death sentence. Right? Like, so a lot of compassion. I have folks on my caseload right now who have diagnosed bipolar illnesses. And part of that work is helping them appropriately frame their experience and what does this really mean. But our cultural narrative, which is already trended toward, if not fully established in the power of victimhood. The misunderstandings of bipolar culturally. Leverage it toward and foster a space of like, I get to use this as my card. And I would just suggest that as we're working with people, the enabling of that mentality doesn't help. As a pastor, as a therapist, as a family member,
So good,
like
man.
it can be real. The life impact can be real. And I go back to like, do you want to be well? Gospel of John, right? Like, do you want to be well? You say you want to be well. What does that look like for all of these areas that we've already talked about, these 4 primary areas? How are you taking care of yourself with sleep, with diet, with exercise, with disengagement from social media? And to add that 5th that we've been talking about, like medication-wise, like are you really fully complying with what a trusted expert medically If you want to get well, like you're gonna have balance and prioritization in those areas.
It's so good.
And if there's not, like, I'll firmly and compassionately kind of push about, like, I don't think you're really bought in to this. Like, you want the power of, I get to blame my failures on this.
Yeah.
When, like, the reality of this diagnosable condition, or maybe more egregiously, like bipolar 2, like I was depressed once and I had some hypomanic episodes, like, good, you've got resilience and you've used tools and skills to not be defined by that. But like then if you're failing a class, it's because you're bipolar disorder. Like, like I'm having a hard time professionally tracking with you there. Tell me about how you make that connection.
Yeah.
Well, I can't think straight. I'm like, well, how late have you been staying up? 3 a.m. every day, getting up at 8 for work. Like, oh, interesting. So like your brain is already ravaged, or you're working the midnight shift, right? Like the graveyard. The last time you actually had a like 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. nights worth of sleep was 3 years ago.
Yeah.
You're telling me that, like, well, I can't deal with people because I'm irritable because of my bipolar. I don't think it's your bipolar, actually. Like, I think it's the fact that your orbitofrontal cortex is ravaged by sleep deprivation.
Yeah.
You've been eating out for 3 years. You haven't had a decent balanced meal. You're not taking vitamins. You're not caring for your body. You haven't exercised in 5 years. Like, this is the story you tell me, and then you're going to blame all of this on your bipolar. Like, I don't think it's your bipolar disorder diagnosis. That's actually causal.
Yeah.
If anything, if it's causal, it's by way of all these other decisions that have been made that have left this channel open for it to be your mechanism, but it's about a version of personal responsibility.
Yeah,
and again, this is not everybody, like, but in a far and away, it's leveraged more for avoiding and skirting responsibility than any other condition that I've seen as a professional.
And it reminds you of the philosophical debate around free will. Do we have free will? Do we not have free will? And of course, from a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview, absolutely we have free will. Let me break in one more time and tell you about reddinkrevival.com. That is REDINK revival.com. I want to encourage you to go there and sign up for our blog e-newsletter. Every month it will hit your inbox with a blog post and new special events that will ink your soul with revival. But when we get into neuroscience and we begin to see wounds creating outcomes and how we became reactive and the formation of our brain around personality issues, there are those who would say, see, you don't have free will. And it's like, wait. And what you just greatly described is that you don't always have free will in the moment of an overload of biochemical expression. However, the decisions you made that led up to that biochemical rush and overwhelming, you did have decisions around.
Which is an awful lot like the story we see in addiction.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Like you might not in that moment be fully responsible for your decision making, but that's not what we're talking about. Like when we're talking about recovery, we're talking about what do we need to modify in the lead up to those relapses, those slips, those returns to problematic behavior. Like you might not be culpable or capable of determining behavior there, but that doesn't mean that there's not a part of your story where you did have free will and did make decisions that led up to that outcome.
So amazing. Well, this is another great episode, and we'll pick up on our next one, talking about more personality disorder. We may pick up a little bit more on this, but thank you again.
Yeah, my encouragement to folks is just to be generous with your language, and just because somebody, unless they've had a professional diagnosis of bipolar illness or any other mood disorder, like be compassionate and don't yourself ascribe that label or language. And for individuals watching who aren't pastors or leaders, like don't self-diagnose. Like please let yourself experience the care of someone who's trained professionally.
Yes.
And when they provide that treatment plan, that it might be painful to make some of those changes, right? Changing your diet and getting to bed earlier and curbing what you're watching and how much of it you're watching, and making sure that if you're on medication, that you're staying faithful and consistent with that. But more than anything, like you don't have to go it alone. If you go it alone, it's not going to end well. But please, like trust yourself to professionals. Let them walk with you, and the outcome can be much, much better.
So good.